Hey guys, welcome to another video. I really appreciate you. This is a alien abduction video. No Bigfoot, no Dogman, but these really cool alien abduction stories sent to us by real people. And none of these stories have ever been released to anybody else before. You're going to hear them for the first time, and they are great. Some people send me emails and they're like, why do you do this old UFO stuff? Why don't you just stick with Bigfoot? Well, I'm going to tell you why I do different stuff. It's because I want to, and it's because I love these stories, and I love reading them, and I love sharing them, and these people send them, and they want to hear them and share them with their friends, and I'm going to do them. So sit back, get comfortable. Man, this video might be an hour long, I'm not sure, but I hope you guys enjoy it. All right, here we go.
Spend all my money on pretty things, diamante shoes, and all these diamond rings. Yes, I spend my money on these fancy cars, on a Jack-in-the-Box, and old trips to Mars. Yes, and I ain't got no shilling left.
Here's a story from Rusty. I got this back last February, I think. Here's what Rusty writes. The story I'm about to tell is true. I have openly talked about it, but only to a select few. This event took place in the early 1980s in central Oklahoma. My best friend growing up and I were roommates, and we worked in the oil fields. We were on a shutdown until the next drilling project started. On this particular night, we met up with two friends to have a few beers like most guys our age did. We rode around for a while, and we decided it was time to get out of town, so we headed out and down a dirt road. We pulled onto a lease road, which happened to be about a half a mile through a pasture to a small airfield. As we sat and talked, I noticed my friend in the front seat would periodically look out the window towards the airfield. I asked him what he was looking at. As he was getting out of the truck, he said, "It looks like that plane is in trouble trying to land." We began to watch the plane's lights and actually started cheering the pilot on. "Come on, man, you can land that plane." It was only a single bright white light. It didn't look like a plane, but what else could it be? It would drop towards the ground, and just before crashing, it would pull up and circle around again. It ran this pattern left to right and then swing back about half the distance and then drop towards the ground and pull up again and again and again. It took several passes and about 30 minutes when someone finally spoke up and said that the plane was not producing any sound. Where was the noise from its engine? We all shut up and we listened intently. In the opposite direction from the light, we heard a low rumble, but it wasn't the plane. The light continued to run the same pattern over and over. We realized the rumble that we were hearing was getting louder. It was then we all realized the rumble was jet engines coming straight to this position. Suddenly, fighter jets burst into view, and now we knew what was happening. We turned our attention back to the light, and it was still running the same pattern as before, but then it dropped in elevation and then pulled straight up into the sky. Then it stopped in midair and began to hover. We all stood there in amazement, staring at this thing. As the fighter jets approached, the light began a slow descent to our left. The jets were almost on top of the craft. In a blink of an eye, it shot straight up, and within a second, it was gone. I can only assume it exited this atmosphere. The jets blew past the location. They broke formation, circled randomly over the airfield before regrouping and heading back the way they had come. We discussed the whole thing with great excitement that night, recounting everything that we saw and how cool the event was. The beer helped, of course. After that year, we all went our own ways, and I've not talked to those guys since. It was a striking example of technology that I know does not exist on this earth to this day. It was not a military exercise. If it was, why were the military jets approaching the light with that aggressive intent? This was actually my second encounter. My first was not as spectacular, but it's a good one too. Thanks for your channel, and we love your videos. Keep up the good work. Rusty, that's awesome, man. Thanks for the story. I really appreciate it. Thanks. Here's an email from Josh that I got back about a year ago, just getting to it, and it's a really good one. This is exciting. Josh writes, my experience with the unknown started when I was a kid growing up in Ohio. My family and I were on a late evening walk. We hadn't even left the cul-de-sac where we lived when our attention was shifted straight up to the clouds. There was a blue-green pulsating light that suddenly swept into a cloud right overhead. It spun around a few times and took off with a speed that I have never seen in any man-made object. Thousands of people saw it that night, including my cousin, who was on the highway across town. It was on the news later that evening, and apparently it had appeared in many different areas around town that night. 10 years later, in a rural area of eastern Ohio, around 10 or 11 p.m., I was driving home on the same road that I take every night. I was listening to the radio and some commercials came on, so I reached to change the channel. Suddenly, the radio went silent, and I felt like I weighed nothing. Everything slowed down and went blurry. A few seconds later, I was fine, and music was on the radio again. I thought it was strange, but I wrote it off as just a weird, forgetful moment that I had had until I realized where I was. In the split second that I had these strange feelings of weightlessness, I had traveled 2 miles or more down the road. I looked at the clock on the radio, and 10 minutes had passed since I looked down to change the station in the first place. I immediately pulled over and looked around, dumbfounded. I had absolutely no idea what had happened. Had I fallen asleep and somehow drove 2 or 3 miles on a wing and a prayer? I don't know. Only 4 years ago, I had broken up with my ex and moved back home. It was the month of July. I was watching TV in my room and had gone downstairs during a commercial to take my evening medication. When I went downstairs, my stepfather came upstairs and had gone into the garage on the other side of the house to smoke. I got to the kitchen counter and I remember looking at the clock. It was exactly 10:20 p.m. I filled a glass of water and was about to swallow my pills, and I was suddenly hit with this light from outside the house. At first, I thought it was a car pulling in the driveway, but it was too bright and the light was all over the room, like it was in the room. There were no shadows. I guess I passed out because I woke up on the other side of the kitchen on the floor. When I got up, I looked at the clock again, and it was 10:45 p.m. I went into a state of panic. I ran upstairs, hyperventilating the whole way. As I ran through the house, not really knowing where I was going, I saw my stepfather in his room watching TV. I had just passed him on his way out to have a smoke. I was freaking out and I could barely breathe. It felt like I had just gotten in a horrific car accident. I could not pull myself together. My head and neck hurt and my throat felt like it had had a pineapple shoved down it. My mother called an ambulance and I was on my way to the local ER in minutes. It was in the ambulance when I finally stopped hyperventilating. I calmed down a bit and was able to think, and it all started coming back to me. The first thing I remembered was being led out of my house through the garage past my stepfather, who was frozen in time, walking out into a circle and being sucked up into space, and it felt incredible. Then I was on a cold metal table surrounded by beings who were holding me down and trying to shove something down my throat, but it wasn't working because I was fighting them. And then I saw it. It was the face. My God, I cannot see anyone's face so vividly in my mind as this one. Holding me down were 4 gray aliens exactly like you see on television. Big black eyes, no nose, and barely any mouth. They seemed to communicate with me telepathically, and they conveyed the message that they weren't there to harm me, but they did let me know that they would if they had to. I saw that face lower towards me, and then everything went blurry. The next thing I know, one is walking into my kitchen and leading me out into the street. I have a vivid picture in my mind of this outstretched hand with 3 fingers and myself taking the hand. It was cold and lifeless, almost like it was an organic robot or something. That is when I woke on the kitchen floor. I was hit with all these memories in a rush in the ambulance, and I started talking to the EMT about it. His face turned white, and he just sat there holding my hand and reassuring me that I was safe. He believed me. I knew he did. He kept asking me questions, and he hung around my room at the hospital as long as he could. He was a great guy, and I wish I knew his name and information so that I could thank him. They scoped my throat and asked me what the hell I did, and I hesitantly told them. The doctor looked at me dumbfounded and told me that I must have had a reaction to the medication I was on. I honestly don't believe this is true because of the time lapse, and if I had just simply passed out and dreamt it all up, that doesn't explain my throat or how my stepdad didn't see me on the floor. The whole experience was terrifying, and I live in fear of another experience or possibility that it could be happening on a regular basis, and I don't know it. I have a range of health issues, and the only explanation I have is that maybe they're studying me so that they can try to eliminate my flawed genes from their pool of human genetics that they're gathering. Well, that is it. As I said before, if you use any of these stories, feel free to rework them as needed. And if you need any clarification, don't hesitate to email me. I really appreciate how you've brought real-life experiences to all of us who've experienced these types of things. It helps knowing that we're not alone. Josh, I really appreciate it. In my imagination, I feel like I would be captivated with it, as long as it's not a violent type thing. And it sounds like Josh had a violent something shoved down his throat. Good grief. But if it was kind of like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, I'd love to see something like that. I think I would travel miles and climb mountains to experience something like that, just to see something that spectacular and different. But that's not the way this one went. This one was not a good experience for the man, and a lot of these aren't. So I'm really glad you shared the story, because you're right. You're not alone, and there's a lot of people out there, and I have a lot of these abduction stories. That's why I'm doing this whole video on it. Thanks, Josh, for the story. It was great, buddy. Thank you. Here's the last story is a long one. It might be 30 or 45 minutes long, but it's so good. I hope you guys enjoy this. The writer calls the story the Fanning Springs Incident. There are events that happen in all of our lives that change the perceptions that we have and the directions we take. Some are subtle, some profound, some surreal, and many unexplainable. Most of the time, we know why and how these changes occur. A combat veteran, a woman giving birth, getting your dream job, or getting fired from one, and so on and so on. The common thread is that we change from these events. Our motivations, expectations, realizations, and perceptions are altered, and we are forced to move on to the next realm of our lives. Be it good or bad or indifferent, time moves us forward, and only memories hold the past. This is the story of an event that happened to me some 30 years ago. I'm putting this from mind to pen to paper because I'm comfortable now, knowing this experience has happened to thousands of people. I have been careful over the years only telling this to close family and friends, mainly because I wasn't alone. 2 of my friends, other bandmates, were with me. Otherwise, I would have told no one. In the early fall of 1978, I was a bass player in a rock band hoping to make it to the big time. You know, money for nothing, chicks for free, or at least making a decent living. This was the 3rd band I had been in since I was 15. The hopes were high as all of the members were great musicians. Although young, they were all talented. Everyone could play several instruments, and we had 4-part harmony except for me, on everything that needed it. We were primed for success, I thought. Although we starved at times, we had worked hard from mid-1977, and of course, we got screwed by a couple of agents. Finally, we found a booking agent who could see that we could make him some money. For starters, he booked us in this out-of-the-way club so he could get a good assessment of what we could do before he booked us into his circuit. This place was in nowhere, just a half a mile south of the Suwannee River on Highway 27, a little town called Fanning Springs, which consisted of a bait shop, a diner, a grocery store, a gas station, a no-tell motel, and the Suwannee Lounge, which I will here on out call the Club. Apparently, the owner of the club owned everything in Fanning Springs, and not surprisingly, the club was the largest building in town. Everything happened from there. We drove down from Tallahassee on a Saturday. The agent wanted us to get set up and checked into the hotel so that some of us could drive over to Gainesville that night to hear his best band play. This was an intimidation attempt that would backfire. He hadn't seen nor heard us live. He would be shocked later, and so would we in a different way. That afternoon, we hung out at the pool. The guitar players, John and Henry, met some of the local girls. Two worked at the club and declared they didn't want to go to Gainesville, that they should stay and practice and watch our equipment and such, especially and such. So it was decided that Terry, our keyboard player, Bob, our drummer, and I would go to Gainesville. We had directions and were told that it was 35 miles from here to the bar. Just get on SR 26 and go east to Gainesville and follow the map. He said it takes 35 to 40 minutes, depending on your speed, and the bar was on the west side of town, so we thought we would leave about 9:15 to get there by 10 o'clock. That way we could see the 3 sets and leave a little after 1 and be back to the motel around 2 a.m. Terry owned a used custom Ford van, long wheelbase and decked out, fully carpeted, even the walls. It had captain's chairs, a big bed, a CB, 8-track, cassette deck, lots of big speakers, cup holders, and all the works. We put all the sensitive electronics, guitars, amps, and synthesizers and so forth in it when we were on the road. It was a great way to go anywhere back then and still is today, and that's what we were driving that night. Terry was one of the most intelligent people I've ever known and definitely the worst driver. I think a lot of highly intelligent people are terrible drivers. He just could not pay any attention to the trivial things like stop signs, red lights, wrong way, and one-way signs. He had almost total recall memory of everything he read or heard. His only memory loss I can remember was selective, as in, I don't know how I crunched the fender on your car, even after I watched him do it. He went to an elite private school that prepped their students for Ivy League acceptance. As I recall, he placed in the top 5% in the nation on his SAT score. His exceptional memory will have relevance later in this story. Bob was also very intelligent, a senior at Florida State. He was only 12 hours from graduation when he joined the band, but he did graduate later. He had excellent logic and social coping skills, which perfectly fit his major, business management. Henry and I both agreed that he was the best rock drummer either of us had ever played with, and a really positive person to be around. He was from Gulf Breeze, Florida, which 10 years later would send my mind into a spin. One point I need to make now is that in the world of rock and roll bands, concerning drugs, we were pansies. There was no cocaine, no psychedelics, no heroin or needles of any sort. I was the only cigarette smoker, and the strongest drugs we did were alcohol, mainly beer, and some pot, and we couldn't afford to buy it most of the time. Usually we begged it off people that we met. We weren't Ozzy Osbourne snorting ants off the sidewalk. We had a 2-set rule, no beer until the 3rd set, and by that time, the crowd was trashed anyway. That being said, I have to get serious now. Terry, Bob, and I piled in the van and we headed east for Gainesville. Right away, we saw there was nothing but farms or ranches, no lights and no traffic, just a really dark road. After 10 minutes, we all remarked about the clear skies and all the stars. I think there may have been a crescent moon because the land around us was dark, but the skies were clear as crystal. We talked the whole way, and the trip went quickly. As we approached Gainesville, the loom of the city's lights changed the landscape, and you could see the ground features much better. I was sitting in the passenger seat, and I saw an illuminated area on my right. It was a nighttime driving range for golf. I didn't play at the time, but I thought it was cool, and I pointed it out. It was about 5 miles outside of town, and we were at the club 10 minutes later. We met the agent inside the club. He had left our names at the door, so we didn't have to pay the cover charge, and he had the best table right next to the mixing board. The band was on break just before 10 o'clock, so we met them and we spent the rest of the night yelling back and forth with the agent during sets and talking with the band during breaks. We were the new guys, and that's the way we thought it would go. As planned, we left the club around 1:15 for the drive back. We knew where we were going this time, and it would be an easy ride to the motel, or so we thought. We were tired. It had been a long day, starting with the 2.5-hour drive down from Tallahassee. Then we had to unload the equipment, set it all up. Sound checks were going to be done Sunday afternoon, so we were ready to sleep until noon or so. As we drove away from the town, the ground started turning dark again. The city lights were behind us, and the sky became clear and full of stars. I was in the passenger chair, Bob was sitting on the bed, and Terry was driving. Ahead of us, about a mile, I noticed lights on my left, and as we got close, I realized that it was a driving range. I recall saying, "Look at that, it's 1:30 and they're still open." We drove past the driving range, and all of us thought that that was kind of cool. From here on out, things become really strange, if not surreal. As if by the flick of a switch, our collective memories were turned off. 1 minute, we're driving along at 60 miles per hour, and then blank. And then as suddenly as we were turned off, we were turned back on again. We all said at the same time, "What's going on?" I looked out the passenger side window, and we were still going 60 miles an hour, and I saw the driving range on my right. We had just passed it a minute earlier on my left. I said, "Terry, we're going the wrong way. You must have turned around." Banging his hands on the steering wheel and screaming, he said, "No, I did not. I did effing not turn around." By this time, Bob was between the front seats, and we both said, "Stop the van." We were all disoriented and confused, talking excitedly back and forth. I didn't know how it happened, but I knew that we were going in the wrong direction. Bob and I told Terry to turn around, slowly. This was a 2-lane road with little ditches on both sides, and this was not his forte. We could easily get stuck. After jockeying back and forth several times, he got it going the other way and floored it. Sure enough, a minute later, we passed the driving range for the 3rd time on the left. Now we're wide-eyed and bushy-tailed. At first I thought maybe Bob had fallen asleep and Terry had turned off on a dirt road and got turned around. Slamming his hands on the steering wheel convinced me that he hadn't. Now Terry is going 80 miles an hour, but Bob and I didn't care. We all wanted to get back to the motel as fast as possible. All of us felt strange, and we knew something happened, but didn't know what. I remember grabbing a cigarette and lighting it. The next thing I know, I'm coughing like it was the first one I had ever smoked. Not something you would expect after smoking for 6 years. We tried to make sense of what happened, coming up with what we thought were rational and logical explanations. They didn't make sense either, but it was not until we reached the motel that we would realize the full scope of this incident. We pulled up in our parking spot in front of the 2 rooms the band had rented. Relieved, or so we thought. Henry and John came running out of their room and said, "Thank God you're all right." We were surprised at first. They said they had been up all night worrying about us. They thought we had been in a wreck or something. We told them that we would be back around 2, and they shouldn't have been so worried. And Henry and John looked at each other and then at us, and they said, "Do you know what time it is?" "No." "It's 5:30 in the morning." "No way," said Bob. "My watch says 2:02. This is a $500 watch my dad gave me." John got his watch and Henry got his, and they both say 5:30. Henry told me recently that we were white as ghosts when we arrived, and we were talking so fast between us that he and John had a hard time understanding what we were saying. It was just gibberish. By the time we finished telling them about the whole night, the answer of the time was final. The sun came up. We had lost 3.5 hours of time, and we couldn't find it. For me, the biggest red flag was the fact that Terry could not remember what happened. This is a guy that has a better memory than 90% of the human population. All of us were exhausted at this point. We closed the curtains and we slept until 3 in the afternoon. That night, after practice and sound checks, we had dinner at the bait shop, the only place in town to go. We didn't talk too much about what happened. There were a lot of more questions than answers, and I believed all of us were in denial. We focused on getting ready for the agent to see us on Wednesday, working on a songs list, sound, and light setups. For me, it was really disturbing. There were questions that needed answers. How could all of us have amnesia at the same time and come out of it at the same time? How could the van be heading in the opposite direction at the same speed at the last location that we remembered? What did we do during that missing time? Where did we go? What caused it? Why us and why then? It seemed to me that we were unwitting victims of some unexplained unknown phenomenon or anomaly. Maybe there were answers and explanations, we just didn't know them at the time. In the next few days, I would have the first of what would be many strange dreams over the next few weeks. Normally, the dreams I had, I wouldn't remember, but this one I remembered every time, and it was always the same. Quietly, I became obsessed with the incident. All of a sudden, I had a thirst for knowledge in subjects that were disinteresting to me before. I had never been much of a reader, just enough to get through school, but now I wanted to read anything that was similar to our experience. When I was 18, I proofread laws for 6 months at a municipal code corporation, and that burned me out, wick and all, but this was different. I wasn't a motivated student in high school and had only taken basic science, biology, and math courses, but music motivated me. A week later, my obsession would move up a notch. We were playing a song that none of us liked, especially me, that the public did, and was in the top 40 at the time. It was called Hot Blooded by the band Foreigner. We called it on the playlist Hot Snotted. It was way below our technical abilities, but we aimed to please. I usually switched to autopilot on this one after kicking the carpet. I could play this blindfolded with one hand tied behind my back and you wouldn't know the difference. As I gazed out over the dance floor and into the darkness of the room, my mind wandered into an epiphany of sorts. We needed to research anti-gravity and antimatter using a true fusion catalyst for interstellar travel. The end of the song came and I looped back in to finish it. But what the hell was that, and where did that come from? Not from me, as I know myself. Later, back at the motel, I cornered Terry and quizzed him for 15 or 20 minutes about what that stuff meant. He knew a lot about physics and sciences in general, but the vernacular in explanation was lost on me. I was left with an empty tank, and he was perplexed why I was asking these questions at 3 in the morning. I decided not to say anything for a couple of weeks until we had gone back home and I had time to fry some more brain cells. A few days later, Saturday came, our last night in Fanning Springs, and we were ready to go home on Sunday. We had done everything there was to do after 2 weeks there except hunt hogs and catch catfish. We slept too late for that stuff, but we ate plenty of catfish at the diner and the grocery store. We were so popular, the local AM radio station a week before did a live interview on air with the rock stars playing at the Sewanee Lounge. Henry, Terry, and I did this live and in person from the DJ's booth, about the size of a Carmen Ghia Volkswagen. The inside, that is. Once they got over our hair, platform shoes, and the fact that we slept through church on Sundays, the locals were super. Our new agent was thrilled. I think he brought everyone he knew over from Gainesville in those 2 weeks to see us, and probably a dozen or so of them came over on their own with their friends. He booked us for 4 months, mission accomplished, except for one. Late in the afternoon, about 4 o'clock, I told the guys I was going over to the gas station to buy a piece of cypress. They had these cross-cut slabs you could make small tables out of, and I thought my mom and my stepfather would like it. They were into refinishing furniture. It would also give me a chance to pump the old guy there about any strange happenings around the area. I walked around out front looking at them, and he came out and introduced himself, and he said his name was Yancey. I said, "Mr. Yancey, I'm Rick. I'm with the band playing at the Sewanee." He nodded and said that he knew. He heard we were good, but he liked country music, and I told him I did too. He smiled and then told me he remembered the radio interview a week earlier, and that was his favorite station. He asked me what it was like there. I told him to get 3 of his friends to come over to the station and stand in the bathroom for 20 minutes and y'all be the celebrities. He laughed good and hard, and we went back and forth and finally got down to some prices on the cypress, and he let me have one of the big pieces for $25. He usually got $50. He went inside, and I followed. I gave him the money and bought a Coke out of the old Coke machine for $0.25. We talked some more, and I asked him point blank, had anyone seen anything strange lately? He told me his nephew and a friend were hunting 2 weeks ago, and they saw some strange lights over the woods of his brother's farm. They said they watched it for 30 minutes and it zipped away. Then he asked me why, and I told him that we thought we saw something too on the way back from Gainesville, but we didn't know what. Of course, we hadn't seen anything. Then I asked the important question, what day was this? He said it was early Sunday morning. They told me about it after church. Chills went down my back. I thanked him and told him I'd be by tomorrow to get the cypress. Right away, I felt there was some connection, but I decided against saying anything until we got back to town. I would talk to Bob about it later. Sunday, we got packed and loaded up. We were ready to go by 3:30. I had John stop with the trailer at the gas station to pick up my cypress, and I thanked Mr. Yancey for everything. He had unwittingly supplied an important piece of my puzzle that I could tie in later. We were ready to get home to our girlfriends and family. After a stop at McDonald's in Perry, we made it to Tallahassee by 7 o'clock. That night, I stayed up late talking with my girlfriend about what had happened. She was open-minded, free-spirited, and was interested in otherworldly things, and she could tell that I was sincere and concerned, but she had no answers either. Bob left the next day for Gulf Breeze, so I couldn't talk with him until Thursday when he had planned to set up and practice in the afternoon. Tuesday, I did something I had never done before. I went to the public library on purpose. I even got my own library card so I could check out books, and spent 2 hours just looking for things to read. My focus was on something similar to what we had experienced. Amnesia victims just didn't fit. There were no multiple incidents involving different people at the same time. I read prologues and forwards from a dozen books about shamans, fairies, Siths, and even psychiatry, and finally I went to the front desk and asked a college student who worked there. He zeroed in on a book by Dr. Benjamin Simon concerning hypnotism. In particular was a case about Betty and Barney Hill, who experienced a period of missing time while driving on a lonely road through the New Hampshire countryside in September of 1961. Under hypnosis 2 years after the incident, they described seeing strange lights over their car and pulling over. 2 or 3 hours later, they awoke in their car. According to Dr. Simon, they told of being abducted from their car and undergoing something of a fertility examination by small beings, then were put back into their car. The missing time was eerily familiar, but I didn't want to think about the rest. 2 days later, I cornered Bob before practice and I told him about my conversation with Mr. Yancey. Also about what I had read at the library on the Hill case. He had a look on his face that I suppose I had when I heard it also, and he said the Hill case made it even stranger. He admitted it had been bothering him since the past week and that he'd had several odd dreams. I told him about mine and he explained his, and they were the same. Then he said while he was at home, he took his watch to the jeweler where it was bought. The guy inspected it and told Bob that it was in perfect working order and spotless inside, and that he couldn't understand why it would stop for any reason, but if it happened again, don't touch it, just bring it in. Bob said it was working when he got back to the motel that night, but it was 3.5 hours behind. He had reset it, and it had worked fine since. After practice, Bob and I decided to hang around a while. He was going to give me a ride home, and we had to work with Terry on some bass parts that he was going to play. John and Henry had to leave, so I told Bob maybe we could subtly work a conversation in about that night or these dreams that we had been having. It didn't take any prompting. Terry proceeded to tell us about these weird dreams he'd been having for 2 weeks. That morning, he woke up in a cold sweat. I bit my lower lip and Bob asked him to describe it. It went like this for all three of us. He was in a white, bright room with no discernible walls or ceiling. The light was almost blinding and he was lying horizontally, but he couldn't feel a table under him. There were gray shadows moving around the room, but you couldn't tell what they were. Some kind of an orb the size of a basketball that looked like an eye was moving all around him from head to toe, looking through him. We told Terry that that was the same dream that we had been having, and then told him about Mr. Yancey and the Betty and Barney Hill case. His thick eyebrows were halfway up his forehead. He still couldn't remember anything from that time period, and neither could we, but he was adamant about not turning around. Not consciously, anyway. At this point, I didn't think he had either. My reasoning was, after passing the driving range, all of us would have to have fallen asleep. Terry would have to stop the van and after 3 hours turn the van around while unconscious or asleep, and then all of us would have to wake up just before we passed the driving range on our right. That was about the best that we could come up with, and as Mr. Spock would say, that is illogical. Personally, I have never been able to sleep well in a car. Many of my friends can attest to that. When I get used to my RPMs of a motor, I will wake up if they slow down or speed up. I have to be thoroughly exhausted to sleep at all, much less for 3 hours. As we talked about it, I asked them what was the last thing that they remembered on the way out of town. Terry recalled the lights from the driving range and me saying that it was odd that they were still open. Bob recalled telling me to turn down the stereo because it was too loud in the back. There was a tape playing in the cassette deck. All of us remembered that it was Steely Dan's newest album, and the song was called FM. We had just learned it 3 weeks before and played it at the club for the first time when we started there. It may seem trivial, but this was the same song playing when we were switched on 3.5 hours later. This is significant because the only way that could happen is if either the tape deck or the van experienced a power outage that lasted for that entire time. On its own, the tape would have stopped in 30 minutes. This would be the last conversation we would have about the incident. We just had to bury it and move on. and it was so weird that we couldn't even speculate on what happened. 10 months later, in the summer of 1979, our band split up. Terry and John wanted to go in different directions. Terry later moved to Atlanta, and Bob left town, and the last I heard, he followed his girlfriend to New York City. She had been signed by a big modeling agency. John went on to a solo career after a couple of bands. Henry became a consummate musician, playing in several very successful local bands, also working at the local music stores, and has been teaching music lessons, especially guitar and effects, for 20 years. I haven't talked with Bob or Terry in almost 30 years, so I have no idea what their recollection of this incident or any effect, if any, on their lives. Henry and I have remained good friends through the years. He recalled some key details for this story, and his recollection is much the same as mine. In particular was a newspaper article the following day that described sightings of strange lights with rapid movements over the same road that we were on in that area, and it was witnessed by many people. This may have been the same aircraft Mr. Yancey's nephew and friend saw early that morning. In the ensuing months and years to come, I pushed this incident as far back in my memory as possible. For the most part, the daily struggles of work and paying bills were enough. Toss in lovers, friends, family problems, and you have a perfectly occupied mind. Well, maybe not perfectly, let's say 95%, and that's good enough. On occasion, with the right prompting, it comes gushing back like a geyser, and did so in 1983 when I read the book called Missing Time by Bud Hopkins. He is a renowned UFO researcher, and the cases in the book closely mirrored what we experienced. I was shaking by the 10th page and read the book in 2 days. That's fast for me. This physical reaction never happened again in reading a dozen or so books and many articles on the subject as time moved on. But on occasion the bell tolled, the compass pointed in the same direction, and when I spun the bottle, it did also. I just wish it had worked at that slumber party I was at when I was 14. I'm sorry, that's just funny. In the late 80s, a wave of UFO sightings were reported in Gulf Breeze, Florida, about a 3-hour drive west of Tallahassee. These were witnessed by literally hundreds of people in a 4-year span. I thought about Bob. He was born and raised there, and I wondered if he had seen them or been involved in any way. Later, in about 1992, I read a book called The Gulf Breeze Sightings by Ed Walters. He followed that one with another, UFO Abductions in Gulf Breeze, in 1994. He had taken photos with the sophisticated cameras and claims to have been abducted, experiencing missing time as well. And the bell tolled. I think by now you can see where this has been heading. Not where I thought it was back then, but where it is now. Quite simply, it seems these events happened either before or after a reported sighting of a UFO. After tens of thousands of documented cases, it appears these phenomenon of missing time are in many cases the result of alien abductions associated with close encounters of their aircraft. Maybe we weren't abducted in the proper sense of the word. Perhaps we were seized and rendered incapacitated in a trance-like state of mind, but one thing is for sure, our minds were manipulated, especially our memory, with astounding precision. I use the term aircraft loosely as they have been witnessed many times going into and coming out of water, especially oceans. Just ask the Navy, they'll tell you whatever you want to know, wink wink. What we experienced was complete memory loss of reality. Awake before and after with nothing in between. This is not the case of forgetfulness or drunkenness. It is a case of 3 of us losing the exact same amount of time. If it had been just me, you would not be reading this at all. There is no question in my mind this happened to hundreds of thousands of people around the world that have not and will not come forward to tell their stories. There is a real fear of being ostracized, or even worse, being branded as a psycho, and it is the consequence of telling your story. Thousands of people have lost their jobs, careers, and families for being honest and coming forward to tell their stories. I have experienced this myself, even though I have been guarded to whom I have told, both family and friends, the look of incredulousness on their face, sometimes a slight smile, and I say to myself, this is no joke. As I peer through these eyes, I can read the name of the psychiatrist's plaque on the door, the only one they know. To say this incident had no effect on my life to date would be a huge understatement or an outright lie to my conscience. The effect was immediate and enduring, changing my outlook on life in general, skewing my thoughts of monetary and material accomplishments. They just didn't matter anymore. I became indifferent towards religions. It was and is inconceivable that they could advocate killing innocent people throughout written history, that it continues today in 2009. The fact is, we have got to expect that we are not the only ones here. We are not intelligent enough to manage this planet as it should be done. They are here for their own agenda. That means that the planet Earth as we know it is more important to them than we are. This is common sense, not conjecture. Our scientists measure themselves on a short stick. They are more intelligent than the rest of us. But are they more intelligent than what is out there? Highly intelligent beings that can traverse galaxies, universes, and dimensions, and we know nothing about them. I don't think so. And if you really think about it, you won't either. And that is the end of the Fanning Springs incident. I'm not sure what else I can add to that. It's just a really well-written, lost time, possibly an abduction experience, and I just loved reading it. It was just great. So that's going to wind it up for this video. Thank you all for listening. It was a long one, and I hope you enjoyed it. And we'll see you on the next video. Thanks, guys.
And I bought a house that goes, yes, I spent my money.